Hi, thanks for joining me. Mindy Mandell here. So today I'm going to go on with Plato's Laws, and today, as you can see, we're talking about Book 8. And here Plato continues the education of the soul. So first, a few words about wisdom in the soul. Now, all of the translations that I've been using throughout the Laws are from Robert Gregg Bury. Our next task is, with the help of the Delphic oracles, to arrange and ordain by law the festivals, prescribing what sacrifices and to what deities it will be good and right for the state to offer. The times and the number of them, however, it is no doubt our own business to ordain by ourselves. Okay, so any discussion of the gods, festivals, sacrifices, it's focusing on our relationship with the gods and our understanding of them. Now, of course, in Plato's day, just as there is today, there's a wide range of understandings of how to read mythology, just as there's a wide range of understandings of how to read the Bible. And you find people have the full range from the most fundamentalist to the most abstract, or people who see the Bible as symbolical. And also in Plato's day, many people saw mythology as symbolical. And that's much closer to Plato's reading of it. Now, there were some later Platonists, such as Iamblichus, who wrote quite a bit about actual rituals and sacrifices and things. And then there's, like, say, Proclus, who also was said to have engaged quite a bit in ritual practice. We don't have any indication of Plato doing so. In Proclus's writings, he often presents the gods as personifications, I would say, of like divine forces. And the way to understand the gods then is to see how these forces function and how they interact with one another. And that's really then the study of metaphysics. And that's very much also the way Plato approached it. He even made fun of fundamentalists in the dialogue Euthyphro, for example, where he kind of poked fun at Euthyphro for taking it all literally. So that's the way that Plato reads it. And so we can see that here, that when he's talking about festivals and sacrifices, it doesn't, you can engage in sacrifices and festivals. It's certainly not incompatible with his philosophy, but the root of it, the significance of it all, is to see how these powers function and how they interact with one another. And so what he's really talking about here then is the study of metaphysics, the study of philosophy. And as one example here, let's take a look at Hades. We also know by his Roman name Pluto. This god should not be disliked by people who are warriors, but honored as one who is always most good to the human race. For as I would assert in all seriousness, union is in no way better for soul and body than dissolution. I think what he's probably trying to say here is that union with the body is no better for soul than dissolution. It's the focus should be, I think, on the soul. And this is because Hades, representing the god of the underworld, the idea of reincarnation is very much a part of our metaphysics, a part of our understanding of the education of the soul and our journey as souls. And the afterlife is in every way ruled by providence, just as our time here on earth in a body is guided by providence. And so Hades is not seen as like a devil figure. Even when you go to Tartarus, which is kind of like hell, there's something providential about it, and there's a certain justice that guides everything that happens to our soul. And so Hades was not seen as a devil figure, as a bad guy. He also has a providential function to him. All right, for a good and blessed life, the first requisite is neither to do wrong oneself nor to suffer wrong from others. Of these, the former is not very hard, but it is very hard to secure immunity from suffering wrong. Indeed, it is impossible to gain this perfectly, except by becoming perfectly good. Okay, that last part, except by becoming perfectly good, it's a little troubling there, because back in Book 4, Plato acknowledged that chance and circumstance play a role in our lives. And this is something that is carried through. Plotinus, for example, uses the example of a house collapsing and killing the people inside. And when that happens, the people will die whether they are virtuous people or not virtuous. And so there is a certain element of chance and occasion, is the two words that were used in book 4, in our lives. And so this idea of securing immunity from suffering wrong if you're perfectly good is a little troubling. Maybe the way to save it is to focus on the word suffering, because if you understand that even hardships that happen to you have a certain providential function, as we saw with Hades, then you won't suffer even when chance and circumstance occur. Going on to courage in the soul. It says that all of us must train for war, not in wartime, but while living in peace. We saw this also in book 7 as well, the idea that it's not when our lives are in turmoil that our practice can really take off, but when we have a certain modicum of stability, then we can really focus on the elements of our philosophy, which he called in book 7, sacrificing, singing, and dancing. And we discussed there what he meant by those. And so it's really this idea that courage really can take root in peacetime. So along with sacrifices, they must continually devise noble games to serve as festival contests, modeled as closely as possible on those of war. So again, whenever war is mentioned or battle, it gives us images of courage. But we don't want to be in battle all the time, literally in battle, in those times of strife. We want to be courageous in times of peace. And so instead of actually being in battle, he's talking about war games in times of peace. So at each of these, they must distribute prizes and awards of merit, and compose for one another speeches of praise and blame, according to the character each one exhibits, not only in the contest, but in his life generally, magnifying him who is accounted most good, and blaming him who is not. Now, these speeches, judging who's been good and who isn't, not everyone shall compose. For first, no one who is under 50 years old shall compose one. Those were again the wise. And further, no one shall do so who, though he may be fully proficient in poetry and music, has not as yet performed any noble or notable deed. What I see significant here is that the idea of the philosopher king as presented in the Republic, or maybe the statesman as presented in that dialogue statesman, is someone who not only has had certain insights into philosophy, has become, as he puts here, proficient in poetry and music, but has also developed the state of mind, has matured the state of mind such that the person can act in the world from that place of wisdom without getting, sucked into what's going on around you, because it's very tempting. Even many people have had profound experiences, insights, have had like enlightenment experiences, but then they still manage to get sucked into the conventional world. It's very alluring, right? Very tempting. And so even having such an experience, it's not by itself enough. There's still a further maturing that takes place to be the philosopher king, the person who's has the insights into philosophy, but can also lead their soul with that philosophy in the world, the philosopher king. And so that's what he's talking about here, performing noble and or notable deeds. In regard both to military operations and to freedom of poetic speech, I state that the same rule shall apply equally to both men and women. The lawgiver ought to commune with himself and reason thus: come now, what people am I to rear up when I have made ready the whole state? Are they not to be competitors in the greatest of contests, wherein their antagonists will be numberless? And the antagonists, of course, at the level of the soul, at the analogy of the soul, would be ignorance, and that is numberless or infinite. Without either live or lifeless training mates, would we not have recourse to shadow fighting of the most literal kind against ourselves? I kind of like this quote just because I often argue with myself. But what we also see here, what I think is also significant here, is that the soul doesn't want to hold any falsehood. And so when we're struggling with a philosophical issue, or when, like, say, an insecurity comes up that makes it hard for us to face that philosophical issue, whether it's of the mundane sort of problem or that deeper philosophical question. Our soul doesn't want to hold a falsehood. And so even if it's not acting itself out in the external world, we're going to see it in our daydreams, we're going to argue with ourselves and so on. Okay, so Plato recognized that as well. They will engage in contests with one another throughout the whole country, contending in the capturing of forts and in ambuscades or ambushes, and in all forms of mimic warfare. Again, the idea of war games at the time of peace. In fact, they shall do literal fighting with balls and darts as nearly real as possible, though the points of the darts shall be made less dangerous, in order that their games of combat may not be devoid of some element of alarm, but may provide terrors and indicate to some extent who is stout-hearted and who not. To the former, the lawgiver shall duly assign honors, and to the latter degradation, that thus he may prepare the whole state to be serviceable throughout life in the real contest. So the real contest being a philosopher king in the world, we gain through our philosophical practice in those times of peace. Are we all aware of the reason why such choristry and such contests do not at present exist anywhere in the States, except to a very small extent? We pause here for a moment. So just a reminder that choristry was a reference back to, I forget, books 1 or 2, where he talked about that in terms of music or the study of states of mind. And the contests he's talking about now, these contests that require courage, are philosophical practice, if you will. So shall we say that this is due to the ignorance of the populace and those who legislate for them? So most people don't engage in this life of studying states of mind and engaging in the philosophical life. What is the reason? Clinius thinks maybe it is just ignorance. And the Athenian Stranger says, not so by any means, my ingenious Clinius. What we ought to say is that there are two causes for why people don't engage in this life, and both are most weighty ones. So what are they? Well, the first cause springs from a lust for wealth, which allows a person no leisure time for attention to anything else save his own private property. And when the soul of every citizen hangs upon this, it is incapable of attending to matters other than daily gain. Well, as the conversation goes on, it's clear that it's not the lust for wealth only, but also what wealth can buy, and in general, the practical life of being focused on the physical world. If we get so caught up in it that we don't have time or make the priority for that deeper, more meaningful way of life, which is the life of philosophy. And the second cause. There lies a cause, as I affirm, in those non-polities which I've often mentioned in our previous discourse, namely democracy, oligarchy, and tyranny, discussed in some length in books 8 and 9 of the Republic. For none of these is a polity, but the truest name for them all would be faction states. In other words, this is the lack of unity in the soul. These are the polities that have an analog in the soul of a soul that is unhealthy and not at unity with itself. And none of them is a form of voluntary rule over willing subjects, but a voluntary rule over unwilling subjects, accompanied always by some kind of force. And the ruler, through fear of the subject, will never voluntarily allow him to become noble or wealthy or strong or brave, or in any way warlike. So when we have these factions in the soul, our soul is not healthy, then we are not virtuous. And so the two causes of why people don't engage in the philosophical life, being caught up in money and the physical world and the practical world, or having these factions in our soul and therefore not pursuing virtue as we should. Okay, now he goes into a discussion of friendship and love in the soul. Friendship is the name we give to the affection of like for like in point of goodness, and of equal for equal. And we also use the term friendship for that of the needy for the rich, which is the opposite kind. And when either of these feelings is intense, we call it love. So sometimes friendship is for like, and sometimes it is for opposites. And so he goes quickly from friendship to love. We'll see here. Now, the friendship which occurs between opposites is terrible and fierce, and seldom reciprocal amongst men, while that based on similarity is gentle and reciprocal throughout life. Now, the kind which arises from a blend of these presents difficulties. First, to discover what the person affected by this third kind of love really desires to obtain. And in the next place, because that person himself is at a loss, being dragged in opposite directions by the two tendencies, of which the one bids him to enjoy the bloom of his beloved, while the other forbids him. So we're calling here friendship or love. First, he's calling it here between similarities versus opposites, or the blend of similar and opposite. Now we're going to get a little clear idea of what these three categories are. He that is in love with the body and hungering after its bloom, as it were that of a ripening peach, there's an image for you, urges himself on to take his fill of it, paying no respect to the disposition of the beloved. Whereas he that counts bodily desire as secondary and puts longing looks in place of love, with soul lusting really for soul, regards the bodily satisfaction of the body as an outrage, and reverently worshipping temperance, courage, nobility, and wisdom, will desire to live always chastely in company with the chaste object of his love. So there's our Platonic love. And so now we see that he has now adjusted these definitions. Love of opposites is soul for body, and love of same, like for like, is soul for soul. And so we can see the third kind would be a love of that combination. The love which is blended of these two kinds is that which we have described just now as third. Since then love has so many varieties, ought the law to prohibit them all and prevent them from existing in our midst? Or shall we not plainly wish that the kind of love which belongs to virtue and desires the young to be as good as possible should exist within our state, while we shall prohibit, if possible, the other two kinds? So he's favoring the love of soul for soul. And that's, again, the idea of Platonic love. And then that brings us then into a discussion of temperance in the soul. Now, this discussion, I will say up front, has not aged well. He's using sexuality as his example of temperance because it's, a very obvious example of seeking pleasure. If you look at just the surface story, it clearly comes across as homophobic and as having kind of biblical notions of sex being only for the purpose of reproduction. So let me give you a quote that really demonstrates that, and then I'll talk about another way to read it, staying within our analogy. I know a device for making a natural use of reproductive intercourse. On the one hand, by abstaining from the male, and because, of course, his audience were only men, abstaining from the male means homosexual sex, and not slaying the set purpose, the human stock, nor sowing seed on rocks and stones where it can never take root and have fruitful increase. Sounds like masturbating outside. Maybe that's where they did it. And on the other hand, by abstaining from every female field in which you would not desire the seed to spring up. This law, when it has become permanent and prevails, if it has rightly become dominant in other cases, just as it prevails now regarding intercourse with parents, is the cause of countless blessings. So again, if you stay in the surface story, it seems homophobic, and you shouldn't masturbate, and you shouldn't have sex with women unless it's for the purpose of procreation. So it has a very biblical feeling to it, and the surface story feels very much like Sunday school, right? But if we stay within our analogy, remember that in the soul, procreation is about giving birth to insights. And so what I think he's really talking about in this section, in this idea of temperance, is that when the soul is guided by the wisdom-loving part of the soul, it only seeks pleasures that lead to fruitful insights and the continuation and prevalence of wisdom in the soul and what is healthy for the soul. And so I think that's really what he's getting at here, because it's not really consistent with other things he's written. if you take it at the surface story, I mean. Now, people think that this life of temperance is unlikely to come about, just in the same way as in the case of the institution of public meals, which will come up again soon. People refuse to believe that it is possible for the whole state to be able to continue this practice constantly, and that too, in spite of the evidence of facts and the existence of the practice in your countries, talking to Clinias and Megillus, and even there, as applied to women, the practice is regarded as non-natural. Thus it was that, because of the strength of this unbelief, I said that it is most difficult to get both these matters permanently legalized. So the idea of public meals, again, the idea in the analogy of the soul is that if everybody's coming together to eat, it symbolizes the idea of a certain unity of the soul, everybody coming together. And one common criticism about temperance, those who are not in this state of mind, who don't know the state of mind, cannot imagine living that way or thinking that way, having that state of mind for themselves. And so it's often accused of being unnatural. And so Plato's acknowledging that here. Now, shall our boys be unable to hold out in order to win a much nobler victory, that which is the noblest of all victories, as we shall tell them from their childhood's days, charming them into belief, we hope, by tales and sentences and songs? What victory is that? Clinias asks. Victory over pleasures, which if they win, they will live a life of bliss, but if they lose, the very opposite. Furthermore, will not the dread that this is a thing utterly unholy give them power to master those impulses which people inferior to themselves have mastered? So again, remember that for Plato, the life of virtue is the truly happy life. The life of chasing pleasures means that you're actually a slave to your whims and to your desires, and so it is a miserable life for him. And so he's saying that if you can hold out over that, if you can win that victory where you let the wisdom-loving part of your soul guide you, where you're only interested in those pleasures that are truly healthy for the soul, then you're going to have the truly happy life, and that is the ultimate victory. Okay, well, 3 ways then to compel souls to refrain from law-breaking, and you'll find this at 841c, and it's through godly fare, through the love of honor, and the love of soul over body. Well, from here he goes into a discussion of nourishing the soul, and he had mentioned eating together in the common meals, and he brings it up again here. Well, now we've arrived at this point in our progress that common meals have been established, a thing which elsewhere, as we say, would be difficult, but in Crete no one would question its correctness. Now, if you're following the surface story only, it seems rather odd to go from that discussion of sexuality to a discussion of common meals. How would that discussion bring you to this point in our progress? Common meals. It seems strange. But if you're seeing all of this as an analogy to the soul and you're following that deeper underlying message in that analogy, then we just saw a discussion of temperance, and that brought us to the idea of a certain unity within the soul, everybody coming together, eating the same foods. And remember, it was described before as where everybody cries about the same things, everybody laughs about the same things. So there's a certain unity of affection within the soul. We're not torn in different directions about the same things, but there's this great unity. Carrying on from that, then we have to think about everybody's eating together, but what are they eating? Are they eating junk food or is it nutritious food? So the idea of common meals leads naturally, to a discussion about the food supply. So next to this comes the question of organizing the food supply and how to make this fit in with the meals. First, then, let there be a code of laws termed agricultural. The first law, that of Zeus the boundary god, shall be stated thus: nobody shall move boundary marks of land, whether they be those of a neighbor who is a native citizen or those of a foreigner in case he holds adjoining land on a frontier, realizing that to do this is truly to be guilty of moving the sacrosanct, since by such an act the convicted person is secretly and violently merging lands into one. So this idea of justice in the soul kind of working in here, and we're going to have a few words about that at the end of the video. But the idea of justice is that each of the three parts of the soul, each of the three aspects are doing their own proper function, and we should not move the boundaries. Now, the idea of water was brought in a previous book, the idea that the wisdom-loving part of the soul, while it is the leader in the soul, it is also a servant to the gods, and so it should be open and accepting divine insights. And that was the imagery before was of water flowing in, if you will, and that imagery is here as well. That water, above all else in a garden, is nourishing, but it is easy to spoil. For while soil and sun and wind, which jointly with water nourish growing plants, those things are not easy to spoil by means of sorcery or diverting or theft. But all these things may happen to water. Hence it requires the assistance of law. Okay, what does he mean by sorcery, diverting, or theft? Well, these three words, which I put in red here, have their parallels in the Republic, and so that can actually be helpful to us. So this is from 413b in the Republic, and these quotes are from the translator Paul Shorey. By those who have their opinions stolen, so that matches, of course, to theft, those who have their opinions stolen from them, I mean those who are over-persuaded and those who forget. Because in the one case, time, and in the other, argument strips them unawares of their beliefs. So we see that if water is representing here this divine insight, then what will strip us of that? Well, will unintentionally, how would we unintentionally drop true opinion or true insight from our soul? And there are these three ways, and one is through theft or being stolen, through forgetfulness, or through argument. Now the second one is a little harder to match up, but it will match up. Diverting doesn't immediately look like constraining or forcing, but let's see how they match. Well then, by those who are constrained or forced, as it says in the Republic, I mean those whom some pain or suffering compels to change their minds. So now if you're thinking of water, if you want to divert a river, for example, you would use something to constrain it or force the water to go in another direction. And then you've diverted it. And so people have changed their minds. And so that's how those two match up. The third one is a very easy match because he uses the exact same word, sorcery. The victims of sorcery, I am sure you too would say, are they who alter their opinions under the spell of pleasure or terrified by some fear. So what he means by sorcery is that pleasure and pain can be a kind of spell over us, a certain charm. And so he calls that sorcery. And so that's, I think, what this quote in the laws is really about. And so, of course, we want to avoid those three ways of inadvertently dropping insight. And what we find here is that, especially early in our practice, there's a certain trial and error that we have to allow for and have a certain openness for. All right, well, since there are countless petty cases for which penalties must be laid down concerning written complaints and citations and evidence of citation, whether the citation requires 2 or more witnesses, in all matters of the like kind, these cases cannot be left without legal regulation, but at the same time they do not deserve the attention of an aged lawgiver. So the young lawgivers shall make laws for these cases, modeling their small rules on the great ones of our earlier enactments, and learning by experience how far they are necessary in practice, until it be decided that they are all adequately laid down. And then, having permanently fixed them, they shall live in the practice of them, now that they are set out in due form. Okay, so that is very much our philosophical life, our philosophical practice. And now just a few words about justice in the soul. So each several craftsman in the state shall have one single craft, and gain from it his living. This is exactly the way Plato talked about justice in the Republic. In the analogy of the city-state to the soul, he said that we each should have only one craft, one way of making a living. And this corresponds in the soul to the idea of the three parts of the soul, each doing their own proper function. It is the wisdom-loving part that is the leader of the soul. The other two parts follow, and they each have their own proper role in the healthy soul. That's justice. All right, so this law, the city stewards shall labor to guard, and they shall punish the resident citizen if he turn aside to any craft rather than to the pursuit of virtue, with reproofs and degradation, until they restore him to his own proper course. And if a foreigner pursue two crafts, they shall punish him by imprisonment, money fines, and expulsion from the state, and so compel him to act as one person and not many. So again, we're not focusing on the surface story. It sounds like a really horrible city-state to live in if this were taken literally. But what we're really talking about is having that unity, not being many different people drawn and pulled in different directions about the same things, having many factions within us, but being one person unified in all three aspects of the soul. And then one final note here, that foreign imported materials for a use that is not necessary, no one shall import. Nor, on the other hand, shall he export any of the stuff which should of necessity remain in the country. So we don't want to let anything into our soul that is not healthy for us, that doesn't belong, if you will. And we don't want to let go inadvertently of any of our true insights. So that brings us to the end then of Book 8. As always, if you like what you see, I really would appreciate a thumbs up. It does help the algorithm. And if you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below, or there is an email address in the description box. So thank you very much, and I do hope that you will join me next week for Book 9. Thank you.